and it is certainly a unique pleasure for me to welcome back an individual who's been quite active throughout the nation on a speaking tour and gaining a great deal of fame. It's interesting that some of his fame is of a special type, because he is perhaps the only American, certainly the only one I know, who has both at one time in a dedicated, disciplined fashion picketed Robert Welch and then later to join the ranks of Robert Welch, and that's quite a distinction. Our next speaker joined the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in 1960. In 1961, he was an active picketer for at a speech that Mr. Robert Welch gave. And he also helped to organize the Freedom Now organization committee, which was part of the Robert F. Williams nationwide organizational network. And while with this organization, he served as introducer, some of the capacity that I'm serving now, but introducer to Robert F. Williams at various cocktail parties across the nation. The Socialist Workers' Party, the Trotskyite branch, the Socialist Workers' Party brought Cesar Chavez to his home in 1961 and asked our speaker to be his right-hand man, but he was turned down. Subsequently, he was offered financing and money by the Socialist Workers' Party if he would go to Guatemala with two communist revolutionaries and help organize Negro cadres for a terror campaign in that land. Finally, he did, however, take the time to personally meet Mr. Robert Welch, the founder and president of the John Birch Society, and like Diogenes, he says that at last he has found an honest man. He is now a speaker for American Opinion Speakers Bureau and edits and publishes a timely newsletter entitled The Voice of Watts. He is also one of the publishers of a very excellent film strip entitled Civil Rights and Black Power. It is certainly a pleasure to welcome once again to the New England Rally for God, Family, and Country, Mr. Charles E. Smith of Watts.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. McDonald, and it sure is good to see so many friends here. I'm going to have a new bumper sticker made. I'm sort of toying this one around. All it's going to say is, George McGovern's not a communist. Try to spread it throughout the nation. There's a changing mood in America. And having been across the country now, going for 2 years, I think there's a mood, a shift in opinion, which most people would never see because you're confined to the little areas where you live. But I tell you that from California to Maine to Florida to Washington, the mood is changing very, very rapidly in our favor. Those of you who think we're losing might begin to think again. Right now, the liberals are seeing a birch under every bed. What's happening, of course, is that most of the conservative organizations have been armed with the truth, and the truth is beginning to get through. Now, I'd like to give some examples of what's been going on. The communists work on deceit, lies, trickery, and finally terror, and their power rests on bluff. Well, bluff can actually work in reverse. Now let me give an example of how lies got me involved in a movement, and then an example of how bluff can actually work in reverse. This is how I got involved in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. I studied almost everything I got my hands on. It didn't matter what it was, but I read the New York Times, Look magazine, Life magazine. Now, I honestly was searching for the truth. And what happened was that when I was all finished searching for the truth, I had, let's say, become involved in a lie, a very big lie. Here's the kind of statement I was reading, and I'd like to read it to you just to show how I was tricked. This is about Fidel Castro. Quote, "This is not a communist revolution in any sense of the word, and there are no communists in positions of control. The only power worth considering in Cuba is in the hands of Premier Castro, who is not only not communist, but decidedly anti-communist." Fidel Castro's John Bircher. Get the message? Well, these are the kind of things that got me involved in that Fair Pay for Cuba Committee. So I studied the movement. I began to study what the socialists and communists were doing, and I adopted certain techniques. Actually, they are simply liars. I didn't become a liar, of course, but I simply studied their techniques, and I realized that they've got a great many people simply telling lies on their behalf. As an example of how the truth works against a lie and how bluff works in reverse, I was a speaker up in Washington, the state of Washington, before a black students' union. And during the course of the talk, I realized that I wasn't going to get anywhere with them, not too far at least, because they had too many people sitting there who were willing to believe a lie. And I had to find a way to just cut the pins from under them and establish some sort of basis. So what I said was, I asked the people in the audience, I says, all right, I'm going to make a statement about the Black Manifesto. But first I want to know, how many people here have read the Black Manifesto? Now, knowing that these people were liars, I knew what was going to happen. About 10 or 15 hands went up. So I looked around at them and I says, you read the Black Manifesto? Yeah, we read it. I says, no, you read the whole thing? Yeah, I read the whole thing. I said, you read the entire Black Manifesto? So pretty soon a couple of hands went down. They were wavering in the first place. So I kept prodding at that, you know, and actually in their mind's eye, I had built this Black Manifesto up to be something about that thick. The last hand up was that of a white liberal. He was a professor of some type, had a little beard. And I finally turned to him and I said, now, all the other hands are going down. And I turned to him and I says, okay, you. Now, you're sure you read the Black Manifesto? He says, which one are you talking about? Bluff can work in reverse. Now, I didn't lie to him. I didn't deceive him or anything. Actually, they tried to lie to me. And I simply knew the truth, that they hadn't read it. And when I was finished bluffing them all down, I pulled out this little sheet of paper about this big, and I said, this is a Black Manifesto. Can you imagine the looks on their faces? Well, from that point on, I didn't have any trouble with them. The mood in America, however, is changing. Our power rests on truth. The truth is going to make us free. Right now, things are changing all across the nation. Let me give an example of how the mood is changing and why I say it's changing. This is based on experience. January 1970, I went on a speaking tour, and on that tour I began talking about, when I had the chance, about something called the New Federalism. Well, you know, most people had real hazy ideas about that, but anybody with an ounce of sense would have known that the New Federalism was nothing but a scheme on the part of Nixon and his backers to reduce the state governments to administrative arms of Washington, D.C., and to finally reduce the local governments down to nothing. Anybody could have seen that. Well, I gave a talk to a number of businessmen, Rotaries and Kiwanis clubs, and some of them accepted what I was saying, but others sort of rebelled and said I was questioning the motives of their president. I go around now, a year later, and I make the same speech, and I tell them about the New Federalism and what the scheme is. And believe it or not, there is absolutely no opposition amongst the businessmen. None. They're waking up. They may not do anything, but they're beginning to wake up. The mood itself is changing. As an indication of how rapidly this mood is changing, let me tell you how I explained the defeat of George Wallace in 1968. Now, I say I explained the defeat of George Wallace, for I firmly believe that had it been an honest election, had it been a free election, that Wallace would have won the thing. There is no question in my mind that the showing he would have made, I think Humphreys would have come in third. Nixon would have come in like a whipped dog. And well, anyway, businessmen are always asking me, and in speeches always asking me, who did you vote for? Now, I feel kind of squeamish telling him I voted for Wallace. But a lot of people are happy about that. But it's sort of beside the point. I tell them how Wallace was defeated. Now, what's most important here is to realize that most people don't know what elections are about. So they asked me about the defeat of Wallace and the election of Nixon, and they want an explanation as to what the next is going to be about, the next election. So in explaining it, what I tell them is this. I say that the communists did not want Hubert Humphreys in office. The communists did not want Humphreys. The reason for it is obvious. Humphreys would have been in exactly the same position as John Kennedy was in back in 1960. I think had Humphreys been elected, none of these socialist programs would have been passed by the administration, because the Congress basically recognizes socialism, but Richard Nixon's too tricky for him. He's really tricky. Well, Humphreys would have been in the same position as John Kennedy back in 1960. So I explained to them what was going on and why they had to get Nixon elected. And then I explained to them that there were three weapons, at least visible weapons, that the conspirators used to force people to vote for Nixon. Now, mind you, this is before an audience, an undifferentiated audience. Here are the three weapons, as I explain them. I say, one, they began a propaganda campaign, and the propaganda campaign said, a vote for Wallace is a vote for Humphreys. They knew the people didn't want Humphreys, so all they had to do was say a vote for Wallace is a vote for Humphreys. The second lie put out by communists, which was used to trick people into voting for Richard Nixon, was, I'd vote for Wallace, but I don't want Humphreys in office. Now, you may not realize how victimized people were by these slogans, but the American people realize it when they're being told. The third slogan they used, of course, was, don't waste your vote. Now, when I explain this to audiences, whether they're businessmen or college audiences or whatever, whoever voted, there are a tremendous amount of people out there who have a stunned look on their faces because they realize what has happened to them. And they're mad. The mood is changing. The mood is changing very, very rapidly. So they asked me then, who do you think the communists are going to back in the next election? Well, I know that the mood is changing among businessmen. I know that. There's no question about it. I also know that when dictatorship comes to America, if it comes, it's not going to come in the name of liberalism. It's going to come in the name of conservatism. Sure. Phony conservatives who are masquerading and say they're going to suppress the mob. So I explained to them how the communists always have a stooge waiting in the wings, waiting on a white horse to capture the businessmen and to capture the people so they vote for the next stooge they stick up. And explaining it, believe it or not, a great many businessmen and people can already pick out the stooge. They suspect, as I suspect, of course, that the man the communists are going to try to put in office, if Nixon doesn't run or if he's defeated or whatever, going to try to put Ronald Reagan in. The businessmen are beginning to wake up. Everybody's beginning to wake up, as a matter of fact, across the nation. Up in Montana, whether it's in Montana or down in Arizona or down in Texas or even in California, the people are beginning to wake up very rapidly. In other words, they're beginning to get out in front of what's going on. Now, before they were always behind it and had to have someone to explain it to them. But now, enough truth has gotten through so that they're beginning to suspect what's going on, and they want to know what they can do about it. The opportunity is ours. The time is ours. All we have to do, really, is offer the solution. In speeches around the country, a year and a half ago, in trying to explain the Warren Court, and this is, again, is the effect of the truth, in trying to explain the Warren Court, I used to say about Earl Warren that Earl Warren was working for communism or socialism, whichever you want to call it. But now, in explaining what was going on, a year ago I got opposition about that. I had people jumping up, ACLU types or whatever, and they would want to call me all kind of names. But I assure you now, in speeches, I say that there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. They are working for communism under the banner of international socialism. And I tell the people that it is still treason to the United States, even though they disguise it as loyalty to an international ideal. And believe it or not, believe it or not, the people understand exactly what it is I'm saying. The people need to be told the truth. You can't bite your tongue about it, you just have to tell them. They may not believe you, but time is running out. Not just for us, time is running out for the other side too. You should remember that. In a battle which is against time, time ultimately is on our side. But in the short range, of course, it looks like time's running out for us. It isn't really. As a matter of fact, if I could say, because of the way the mood's going, I think the communists are scared. I think they're scared half to death. You may not believe it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be sticking up so much visibly communist nonsense in the streets. Anytime a man has to jump up and down on the soapbox, scream and shout, and try to convince everybody he's a communist, something's wrong. So you got Jerry Rubin and the boy jumping up and down, I'm a communist, I'm a communist. And the American people say, oh, so what? Apathy's working in our favor. Again, to indicate how the mood is changing, I was told that, because many people appear on television, especially Birchers, I got this access through the society. We have a lot of speakers, and the average number of calls, the average number of letters they get from a speaker who appears on television, say appears for a half hour, you get maybe 7 to 10 replies. That's all. That's the average. You go on a radio or a television or whatever, and you talk to a large audience, there might be 500,000 people in the audience, you'll get 7 to 10 replies. Funny thing about it was I went on a show in Cleveland. I was on for 15 minutes, 5 of which were really commercial time and everything. And when I got back to San Marino, they had been deluged by 300 replies. Now, for a show, that is actually a tremendous number of people who want to know. Actually, what I told them, I said, look, I said, you want to know what's going on? Okay, you put $1 in an envelope, just write down Canada, and send it to the John Birch Society in San Marino. So it was just deluged out there. Now, the mood is changing. This is something that couldn't have been done a year or so ago. The reply still would have been 7 or 8. The mood of the American people is changing, and people always ask me, what did you say to get such a response? Actually, I've worked out a series of epigrams, and I've got it worked down now to where I can give a practical view of the conspiracy in 2 minutes. And have it make sense. I know the people, the American people already understand what's going on. They already have the information. The American people don't lack information. They really don't. They don't lack knowledge. As a matter of fact, they've got too much information. What the American people lack is understanding. They're being distracted so many times that they haven't got time to think about what's going on. The information's already there. So all you have to do, actually, is take all the information they have, condense it into a couple of sentences, say, bing, bing, bing. You've done 10 years' worth of thinking for them. Now, as a further example of how the mood is changing, and rapidly, in talks, in the civil rights talks, I always get into the CFR. And again, I've got about a 2-minute thing where I can explain it. And it makes sense. I don't let it any other way, see? I give this 2-minute talk about the CFR and who's in it. Then I tell them, and this is right in an audience, I say, Robert McNamara, this is especially in conjunction with these Vietnam papers now. I say, Robert McNamara, Henry Cabot Lodge, Dean Rusk, Henry Kissinger, Dean Acheson, Walter Rostow, Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. and Sr., if they're still alive, Clark Clifford, McGeorge Bundy, Paul McCracken, Elliot Richardson, Henry Fowler, Richard Nixon, and the men in the CFR should be tried for treason. And now, in an audience where you have people coming off the street, you won't believe this, but you're going to have to believe it. But I've been saying that, and just the rinky-dink Americans have been giving a standing ovation. The mood is changing. The mood is changing very rapidly. It's changing in our favor. You can see this if you go across the country. It's very difficult to see it in one position, one place, because the shift is so slight that you wouldn't notice it even in your neighbor. It's very difficult. But as you go around and talk to businessmen, as you go around, and even the newsmen, as you go around and talk to them, they sort of know what's going on now. They suspect that they haven't got the answers, and they're willing to accept your explanations. On college campuses, I love to talk on college campuses and high school things. I don't know, some people don't like it, but I think it's a challenge. I have a wonderful time on college campuses. I really do. And recently, what's been happening this year is that I had to curtail some activities up in Seattle area. I went up to see how many names we could get. I went up to see how many students were genuinely interested in what was going on. So the talk I gave last year, called The Function of the Riots, I use that as a base. Only it's very highly polished now, so that I have a series of click, 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 little epigrammic statements, and the students understand what's going on. And the only limitation on the number of names we collect is the number of cards I got available to pass out. The students want to know. It has been my experience across the country and in high schools and in colleges that even the professors have been asking me to supply libraries for them. They are going to make it required reading, and we've been doing it. The mood is changing very rapidly. It doesn't matter whether they're bearded professors, whether they're shaved heads or what, the mood itself is changing. And I mean it's changing very, very rapidly. The students know they haven't got the truth, and the teachers know it too. I had a teacher, funny thing, I had a teacher to indicate this. I went and spoke out in a school in California. This was a high school. I drew a chart on the board. Apparently the students had never seen a chart. They had never had anybody tell them just anything. And I drew the chart. I gave the talk. I was ready to leave, and I always erase it from the board, and the teacher ran up and he says, "Wait a minute. You're not going to erase that, are you?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I'm going to clean the board up." He says, no, he says, "Leave it up there." He says, "That's the first thing I ever heard that made any sense." I went back to the same school a year later. Incidentally, the teacher's name was Martz. It was M-A-R-T-Z, actually. And he had been inviting Birchers in all the time so they could beat up on the Birchers. So that's what he was doing, sort of beating up on them a little bit, and had the students champing at the bit. I went back to his class last year. He invited me back. And this year, as I gave the same talk and explained it to them, at the end of the talk, the students asked questions, and the teacher actually panicked. He rushed up to me and he says, "You know what the problem is?" He says, "They're looking over there, and the problem is over there." A year ago, he didn't even know that. See? That's what he learned from the charts. So we supplied a great big library for him. I don't know how effective it'll be, but I think he's going to use it. He's going to wake up. Or to take an experience up in Arizona. The people are beginning to wake up. Teachers, students, everybody. The mood itself is shifting. It is shifting in our direction. It's a very subtle thing. It's a very slow thing. But basically, I think that what the communists are afraid of is that if they precipitate a crisis in this country and the people don't react and run in a million different directions, that the game is over. That's what they're afraid of. The mood is changing, and the people are coming in our directions. I spoke at a class in Phoenix. This was a college class. At that class, it was the first meeting of the class. I happened to be in the area. And the funny part about it was that I showed up at the class with the coordinator, and the teacher got up and he says, "Now we're going to be very fair this year." I think it was called Current Problems or something. "We're going to be very fair this year. We have invited a whole series of speakers." And he pulled out his list. He's representing all different views. He pulled out his list: women's liberation, Cesar Chavez, Black Panthers, Black Power, everything. And then he said, "We are lucky, though, because our first speaker is from the John Birch Society. Well, it was me. So I got up and gave this talk, and again, it was the function of the riots, a very slick thing now, and they taped it. Well, I made him tape it, as a matter of fact, because I told him I didn't want any distortion of the thing. Well, I had figured out what the other guys were going to say, you know, women's liberation and all. They've got one solution for every problem. That solution, of course, is more government. So I hammered at that point, and I got that point across to the students, and in the question and answer period that followed, I made sure they understood what was going on. And pretty soon the students, the teacher, everybody understood what we were talking about. A week later, I was giving a talk again in Arizona, and one of the students who had been in the class happened to see the poster, and he came to the talk that night and brought several friends. After it was over, I was supplying him some little packets I had made up, and we had lunch, and he said to me, he says, I've been in college 3 years, and that was the first learning experience I ever had. That is really a sad commentary on American education as to what's going on. But he also told me that in the classroom that they had gone over the talk, they had a critique on it, they had evaluated and everything, and he said that nobody could find anything wrong with it. Now, I assure you that women's liberation is not going to have too good a time in that classroom. Now, one thing which should be noted, of course, is that the opposition we used to face, the fierce opposition, that is this wall of indignance, they used to face us all the time, and the ridicule, that wall is crumbling right now, right before your eyes. It is crumbling. Even the Birches are beginning to recognize that. You may not quite understand what this means, but amongst the members of the society and their friends and the patriots all over, they want to know why I have such optimism about winning this battle. And I explained to them the process by which the communists kill people. The communists have many, many crucifixions. The process of crucifixion, of course, first includes ridicule, scorn, driving a person from public view, and if he's on our side, quietly assassinating him. No one survived that. Though McCarthy didn't survive it, most people couldn't survive it. So I tell the Birchers that, in my opinion, Robert Welch is the first man ever to have survived their smears. And because he survived it, once you understand it, you know that so will we. Make no mistake about it. I think if the communists could turn the clock back and take a mistake that they made, I think the communists made two mistakes. The first mistake they made, from their point of view, the first mistake they made was in getting involved in this conspiracy in the first place. The second mistake they made was really, when you get down to it, the second mistake they made was in allowing Robert Welch to survive. You may not believe it, but I tell you, that single act is what's going to win this thing. You may not know it yet, but we're going to win it. Now, even amongst the Negroes, the Negro population is beginning to wake up. Matter of fact, speaking around the country, we are beginning to get joiners. Even the Black Panthers are waking up. I had a talk in Arizona, and it was horrible. It was in the Negro community. It was in a mixed neighborhood, actually, and the head of the NAACP showed up. All these Panthers wearing these berets and stuff showed up. All these criminals. The OEO had an organization down there of criminals. You had to be a felon, an ex-felon, to be in the organization. So the thing was crowded. And during the course of the talk, one of these men came up. He had a little beret on here and black Africa button or something or other. And he told me, he said, I'll cut your throat. Now, it was really hair-raising experience. It was. And I sort of looked at him. It was kind of it was really a bad situation. I don't want to get into it too much, but I wasn't about to run. And I wasn't about to stay there. Well, the guy told me he was going to kill me. he told me, he said, you see these people, they had stirred up some trouble in the audience. And they really had something going there, you know. And the head of the NAACP stood up, and he had an Africa robe on and all, and he would denounce me and everything. And it was really a riotous session. So he stood there, and he heaped all kind of abuse on me. I made a tape of it. We had a tape of it, and we played it for the office help in San Marino. I wasn't there because I didn't want to hear them words again, see? So he told me, he says, these people want you dead. You see? See them? And he started pointing to all the little stooges out there. And he told me that he was going to give me 5 minutes to get out of town. And I couldn't really argue with him, you know, because he was in the majority with all them people there, and I didn't have any help. He gave me 5 minutes to get out of town. He told me, he says, I ought to kill you right now. He said, that's why I came up here for. I came up to the front here to kill you, but I'm going to give you a chance. Because I don't believe in killing one of my brothers. And even if you are misguided, you're still one of us. So, okay. He says, I'm going to walk out the door over there. And I don't want them to think I'm running you out of town, see? He says, I'm going to walk out the door over there and give you 2 minutes. I'm going to smoke a cigarette, and I'm going to come back in. When I come back in, I don't want anybody standing in front. I want you to be gone. See? So I'm going to give you a chance to get out. So he swaggered out the door, and I stood up at the talk, and I went on with the talk, see? And then he came back in. So when he came back in, his chest was about that wide, and his shoulders were up, you know. Came walking down the aisle. As he got closer to me, he realized that I wasn't going anywhere. And he also realized that if he was going to kill me, he was going to have to do it all by himself. I wasn't going to help him. Now wait a minute now. You see, it takes two to make a fight. So his threat was the first blow. If he's going to kill me, that would have been the second blow. It says in the Bible, turn the other cheek. And I believe in turning the other cheek. This is the essence of what that means, actually. Now, I was on a radio show then, right after that, TV show, and the announcer had heard about this, and I just stood there. Well, a guy came back up front, and as he got closer to the front, you could see all of his courage, all of his bravado just sort of melted. And by the time he got to the front, he was like a little meek lamb. And he sort of eased up to the front, and he sort of put his head down and sat down in the front row. And I kind of felt sorry for him. I really did, to have brought the mighty down so far in the eyes of his people. The next day, I had an experience relating to this on a television station. The word had gotten around, and they wanted an interview. So I was interviewed there, and the newsman said to me, the cameras are rolling, he says, tell me about this incident. So I told him about it. And he says, well, he says, you didn't run. I says, no. He says, well, I guess that proves one point. And I said, what's that? He says, it proves that the Birchers are well armed, ready for anything. Now, this is on television that they're recording. And I says, no. I says, that's not what it means. And he was sort of surprised. He said, oh? And I said, what it means is this. It means that I've made my peace with the good Lord. And if it's time to go, I'm ready to go. Believe it or not, the look on his face, it looked as though he had been stricken in the heart. It did. I can't really describe the look. It's as though you come home and someone were to tell you that your mother and father and all your relatives and friends have all just died suddenly. The shock on his face. They wouldn't sit on television, but they should have, because this is the kind of thing. Now, the mood is changing. Even that newsman saw what was going on, that we're willing to make some sort of sacrifice. I've seen the mood change amongst people who thought the Negroes were the enemies. I've seen the mood change amongst people who thought the Jews were the enemies. I've had people come up to me and tell me, after a talk, they say, I thought the Negroes were the enemies. But I know different now. He says, and then they want to, now it's hard to explain this here, but here are people, you can see their face with hatred on it. You can see it. It sort of oozes out of the skin. And then they come up and they say, I know you're right. You know, I don't know how I got in that. They can't figure out why they hated, but they know they've been had, and they're mad. We supply literature to them. It is the determined look in their eyes, and it's the set of the jaw when they walk away that will tell you that the mood is changing. It is changing very rapidly. It's changing in our favor. Now let me end up here by telling an experience I use to bring the Negroes and the white people together when the audience is mixed and when obviously there's a wall of misunderstanding between them. There are some charges by the Negroes that I don't want to solve the problem, and then there are some charges by the white people that the Negroes are all wrong in their grievances or whatever. So I explained to them what happened to me, and this is what begins to make sense to people. And this is why I say we're going to crack this thing. We're going to solve this problem in short order. I explained what happened when I got out of high school. I graduated from high school in 1949. When I got out, I went to get a job. Everybody wanted a job. Well, I went over to the B&O Railroad, that's the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and they told me, they said, well, we would hire you, but you need 2 years' experience. It was in Pittsburgh. See? And I went to Messer Machine Company, Pennsylvania Railroad, and the story was the same. I see the ads in the paper, they were hiring. So all the Negroes wanted jobs, just like the white guys. Well, all the white guys had jobs. They got out of high school and went right to work. So I thought they just got hired, I went over. And all the time they kept telling me I needed 2 years' experience. Now this is what I tell the mixed audiences when we're explaining what's going on. And I tell them, I say, well, I didn't have 2 years' experience, and pretty soon I started thinking about that. I said, wait a minute. How am I going to get 2 years' experience if you won't hire me in the first place? Yeah, it's just a lie. So then I tell them how I went out every morning looking for jobs, and I never could find one. And one day I was sitting on a corner, we'd been looking for jobs, and out of the B&O Railroad, there came some neighbors of ours. This is a bunch of white guys who were 15 years old. Now, I grew up in a very mixed community. It was all refugees. A lot of Italians and Ukrainians, Czechoslovakians, Poles, the people who had fled Russia. I grew up just amongst immigrants. And they came out of there working. They were 15 years old. I knew these people, and they were still in school. So I talked to them a while. Here's what had happened. The Union had gone down to the American Legion and told the Legion they were hiring. So the guys in the Legion brought their brothers and cousins and twins down, and anybody who wanted a job. Now, Negroes couldn't go in the Legion. So no Negroes got jobs. It didn't make any sense to me at first, and it won't make any sense to you until you begin to realize that the very people who refused to hire the Negroes, the very people who set the policies for the unions, were the very people sitting on the board of directors of the NAACP and the National Urban League. What they were doing was making the problem and then financing the protest. And of course, the net result of that is that the Negroes and the white people were supposed to fight. Now, still there's a wall of misunderstanding, so as further explanation, I tell the people, if the Union had come to the Negro church and told the Negroes they were hiring, I would have gotten a job. I wouldn't have been trying to freeze any white guys. I was trying to get me a job. It wasn't the race thing at all. So in explaining this, one heartening thing happened, because after meeting, this Negro was very hostile. He'd been hostile during the talk. And then when I explained what was going on, after the meeting, he came up to me and he says, yeah, he says, you know what? He says, I know exactly what you're talking about. He says, the only thing I regret is that they didn't give me the job. Yeah. He said he wanted to be discriminated in favor of. Now really, he's beginning to see what's going on. He understood it. And he also understood that the way to break the back of this thing was to get those guys out of there at the top who have been doing that. And I assure you that the wall between the Negroes and the white people is beginning to crumble, even while it looks like it's getting higher and higher and higher. It's built on shifting sands, and the truth is sort of getting through at the bottom. That whole thing's going to collapse. The collapse is going to be so sudden that even the people in the audience are going to be shocked by it. But most of you, I think, know what's going on, or you suspect what's going on. It's not what you think. Let me conclude then by saying that people simply want to know the truth. Both the Negroes, the white people, the businessmen, the laborers, the students, the professors, the people want to know the truth, and they are now accepting the truth. It's a very simple job for us to get the truth across now. This is our hour. This is our time, and it is now our victory for the taking. In the words of G. Edward Griffin, Ours is an idea that has come of age, and there is nothing they can do to stop us. Thank you.